Welcome everyone. I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is joining us today. We're really excited to present this work. We'd like to first thank the INEE for hosting this webinar and for always doing such a fantastic job of knowledge sharing and community building. So thank you so much, INEE. My name is Nina Papadopoulos, and I am a senior education officer at UNHCR based in Copenhagen, Denmark. And I lead the basic education team in the education section at UNHCR. We proudly present the latest research led by the Secondary Education Working Group, which we call the SEWG. Everybody loves a good acronym. This is a global platform convened by UNHCR and Plan International alongside UN agencies, NGOs, bilateral partners, foundations, and researchers. We are united by one goal: to expand access to secondary education for refugees and crisis-affected young people. We meet today at a time of enormous change. Across the world, foreign assistance is shifting. Humanitarian resources are under enormous strain, and traditional funding models are no longer guaranteed. In this environment, the stakes could not be higher. Without urgent, sustainable, cost-effective responses, generations of young people risk being left behind. That is why SEWG's work matters more than ever. We are not just advocating for education. We're building the pathways for forcibly displaced learners to be included within national systems, to thrive and to lead. Today's discussion is a call to action, to innovate, to collaborate, and to ensure that education for refugees and forcibly displaced young people is not an afterthought, but a fundamental right embedded in every nation's future. This research addresses gaps in secondary education access and was initiated in response to ongoing gaps in the access to secondary education for refugees and displaced adolescents and youth. The aim was to investigate how these adolescents and youth can be more effectively included and integrated into national education systems. This is especially important for refugees. Drawing from case studies in 4 countries, Colombia, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, Nigeria, and Rwanda, this work highlights progressive policy approaches that foster inclusion. These contexts were selected because they exemplify national education policies intentionally inclusive of displaced populations. And the research ultimately informs an action agenda designed to enhance enrollment and retention at the secondary level. Secondary education is key to protection and self-reliance and protecting early marriage for girls. So why are we discussing secondary education? Secondary education is a vital pathway to protection. It plays a critical role in preventing early marriage and child labor, supporting psychosocial well-being, and facilitating access to higher education and employment. It also plays a critical role throughout the entire education cycle. For example, it supports the development of future teachers, especially female teachers who are in high demand in many refugee hosting contexts. Girls who complete secondary school are better positioned to pursue teacher training, creating a ripple effect that benefits future generations. Secondary education also opens doors to higher education and vocational training. But low completion rates, especially among refugee girls, can restrict access to these opportunities. Access to secondary education remains deeply unequal for the forcibly displaced. The global secondary gross enrollment rate for refugees is just 42% in low and middle income countries, compared to 65% for primary education. Furthermore, gender disparities persist in some countries. Only one girl for every 3 refugee boys is enrolled in secondary school. These gaps reflect not only logistical and financial challenges, but also barriers linked to displacement, poverty, and discrimination. That's why investing in secondary education, it's not just an educational goal, it's an essential protection measure and a strategic investment in resilience and long-term inclusion. So how can we make secondary education genuinely accessible for refugees and displaced adolescents and youth? The answer lies in inclusion. And we use this term inclusion specifically linked to inclusion in national education systems. When refugees are integrated into national education systems, they gain access to accredited, high-quality learning pathways that support long-term development. Inclusion reduces the need for parallel structures that are often underfunded and limited in scope. Inclusion also fosters social cohesion. When refugees and host community children learn alongside one another, it helps break down divisions and builds shared futures. It affirms the right for every adolescent and youth to quality education, regardless of status. These challenges are exacerbated by chronic underinvestment in secondary education, particularly for refugee and displaced populations. Host countries already face immense pressure on their education systems, and few can meet the educational needs of refugees without significant external support. Inclusion requires coordinated and adequately funded strategies that acknowledge the shared responsibility among host governments, donors, humanitarian actors, and development partners. Discussing inclusion in national education systems is particularly timely today. Education in humanitarian contexts has long been underfunded, and now our sector faces a crisis. With escalating emergencies in places like the DRC, Gaza, and Sudan, alongside increasing pressures on humanitarian and development financing, millions of crisis-affected children and youth risk losing access to education. Achieving meaningful inclusion requires coordinated action across various sectors and alignment with national socioeconomic systems, including safety nets, financial services, vocational training, and employment pathways. Today's webinar will highlight how governments and partners are working to include forcibly displaced adolescents and youth in national secondary education systems, along with the challenges they face. With these funding shortfalls that we're all experiencing right now, cross-sector collaboration and national policies are more essential than ever to ensure that education system can support refugee learners. Now I would like to invite Dr. Chris Henderson and Whitney Hugh from Teachers College, Columbia University, who led the research to share the high-level findings and the action agenda. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nina, and special thanks to UNHCR and Plan International really for championing secondary education, not just at this present time, which is a very urgent time, but over the last number of years. And Whitney and I have been lucky to be involved with a couple of projects now, being able to really investigate why secondary education is such a priority, but also such an overlooked area of education in emergencies. And just briefly, so everyone's aware of today's agenda, and it's fantastic to see so many familiar and new names in the attendee list. So welcome everyone. So as Nina introduced, Whitney and I will give a brief background in terms of the findings and so the rationale behind this publication, and then we're very lucky to be joined by 2 guests from Colombia and KRI, who were able to support us in really meaningful ways to bring this research to life. And following that, provided we have sufficient time, it would be fantastic to hear questions from you, the audience, in terms of your thinking or recommendations for how to further promote refugee youth inclusion in national secondary education systems. So just firstly, in terms of this title, on the Precipice of Progress, I want to give you some background because in our previous collaborations with UNHCR and Plan International, we produced a publication called The Missing Piece. And this publication really provided a stocktake of the evidence pertaining to secondary education in emergencies. And what we found is that rather than an established body of literature, there was this kind of patchwork of secondary education adjacent studies that we had to stitch together to really understand how forcibly displaced adolescents and youth experienced and benefited from secondary education in emergencies. And through doing this, we also learned about the individual and societal consequences of their exclusion. And so overall in this Missing Piece publication, apart from our identification of the broad benefits of secondary education, and especially on their mental health, their well-being, their academic development, and their employment pathways, this publication painted a somewhat bleak picture. So there was some promising progress we found in early childhood and primary education in emergencies, but secondary education in crisis contexts was ill-defined, largely overlooked, and grossly underfunded. So given the kind of tone of that first publication, for this latest publication on the Precipice of Progress, we really wanted to document examples of promising secondary education policies that really did increase adolescent youth and inclusion in secondary education, and particularly in national systems. And so as we began this process, while we found some progressive policies, what we found is they were more often broader national policies focused on refugee and migrant inclusion, through which forcibly displaced adolescents and youth were able to access secondary education. And at the same time, while these were enabling policies and they were in place in the context that we looked at, we also found a number of barriers that meant that the inclusion of these young people was not necessarily guaranteed or continuous. Next slide, please. And so on the note of this idea of policy openings, we were really inspired by our colleagues, Mary Mendenhall and Danny Falk, who are also at Teachers College, who have done a lot of work on refugee inclusion in Kenya's national system. And so as we worked through this process, through this project, sorry, we really came to understand the power of this concept of policy openings. So where specific policies for adolescents and youth were lacking or not yet formed, by finding these policy openings, we were seeing that there were opportunities to promote the educational and development needs of this population. And so in this way, with UNHCR and Plan International support, we were able to select the four contexts. So that was Colombia, Iraq, KRI, Nigeria, and Rwanda, to really investigate how these openings might work to promote the inclusion of displaced adolescents and youth in national systems, and better understand specifically what the enablers of their enrollment were and what some of the barriers to their retention might be. And just before I pass over to Whitney, reflecting the urgency of this topic, we only had a 3-month window to conceptualize the scope of work, to conduct the research, and to analyze the findings. And this approach included a literature review, interviews with 3 to 6 key actors in each of the contexts, and focus group discussions with youth in Colombia in particular. And just as a brief background in terms of the populations we worked with, so in Colombia, it's with migrants from Venezuela. In the Kurdish region of Iraq, it's Syrian, Iranian, and Turkish refugees. In Nigeria, there are large numbers of internally displaced Nigerians and Cameroonian refugees from both Anglophone and Francophone regions. And in the Rwanda case study, we're focused on refugees from Burundi and the DRC in particular, who are included in the national education system. So on that note, I'll pass over to Whitney to dive into some more specific findings from the study.
Thank you, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, through the research, we identified national policies in each context that have furthered the inclusion of forcibly displaced adolescents and youth in national secondary education systems. I'll give a high-level overview of some of the enablers and barriers associated with each policy context, but we encourage you to read the report for the nuance, as we do have limited time. So in Colombia, as the first example, approaches have shifted in managing Venezuelan migration from a short-term humanitarian crisis to a long-term development strategy. And in doing so, investments in education system inclusion are seen as an opportunity to reduce social tensions and promote economic growth. This approach has been furthered by policies such as the Estatuto Temporal de Protección para Migrantes Venezolanos, issued in 2021, which regularized the status of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia and provided access to the same rights for them to education services as Colombian citizens. Venezuelan youth in Bogota who participated in focus group discussions for this study highlighted that their access to national secondary education was a transformative opportunity for employment, personal development, and social belonging, and thereby supporting pathways for them from secondary education into higher education and the formal economy, thereby motivating their secondary school enrollment and retention. Barriers do still exist, of course, to full policy implementation. As one example, the inconsistent system level resourcing and guidance across rural and urban areas have contributed to varying levels of policy application. Now, to move to the next context, in Iraq, the Kurdish regional government is transitioning Syrian children, adolescents, and youth from parallel Arabic schools for refugees into the Kurdish education system. In 2022, the Kurdish regional government introduced the Refugee Education Integration Policy, which aims to reduce the cost and disruption of parallel refugee education systems while improving social cohesion between refugee and host communities. A standout feature of the policy that has really supported enrollment and retention is the inclusion of Syrian refugee teachers in the national system. To date, over 1,100 refugee teachers have received training in the Kurdish language and curriculum and currently receive similar salaries as Kurdish teachers. So that's been a big enabler. However, of course, barriers to full implementation of the policy still exist. As one example, limited infrastructure, teacher shortages, and a lack of flexible education pathways back into the education system for those who have left hamper its impact. And we'll speak more of these contexts during the panel discussion portion of this webinar. So next slide, please. To move to the next context, in Nigeria, the government has placed extensive focus on improving the out-of-school rate through policies related to school safety and security. The government established the National Policy on Safety, Security, and Violence-Free Schools in 2019, which leads school disaster management and protection initiatives against violence, abductions, and attacks. This policy has enabled enrollment and retention, given that insecure and unsafe school environments are a major factor inhibiting youth and adolescent schooling in Nigeria, particularly when intersecting with the vulnerabilities associated with displacement. Key informants indicated that this policy eases the risk or burden of attendance by holistically addressing physical, material, environmental, and psychological safety, and has also helped to bridge the gap between development and humanitarian approaches to education and emergencies through its efforts to reduce the effects of everyday risks, threats, and disasters. One key policy implementation challenge, however, has related to applying this policy in the federal governance system in Nigeria. While the government did establish a multi-trust donor fund to fund this initiative, the inconsistent funding and implementation of federal level education policies at state and local levels have created a variable patchwork of barriers and opportunities for secondary education inclusion. And then finally, in Rwanda, the national adoption of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework has integrated 35,000 refugee secondary school students and 18,000 primary school refugee students into the national education system. This has meant that forcibly displaced adolescents and youth also benefit from government investments in school feeding and psychosocial support, alongside numerous schooling cost reduction incentives for students. Key informants noted how school feeding programs have been a game changer for student retention, as have boarding schools financed by international NGOs where basic life and learning needs are met. And through this policy, displaced youth and adolescents have also benefited from Rwanda's 12-year basic education strategic plan, which provides free education through upper secondary school. And this, of course, creates pathways for forcibly displaced youth to access higher education, vocational training, and better job prospects, thereby enabling longer-term economic integration and self-reliance. To briefly address the barriers, however, key informants spoke of the funding and infrastructure challenges that these policies give rise to and represent. Currently, there's no concrete budget associated with the strategic plan, and infrastructural issues such as the availability of secondary schools and communities, a shortage of teachers, the capacity of classroom spaces, and the extent to which these schools have a consistent supply of water, electricity, and whether they're climate or disaster risk resilient are still concerns. So that's just a very brief overview. Again, we're happy to talk more through the Q&A about the nuances of each of these policies and the enablers and barriers, but I'll hand it back over to you now, Chris.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Whitney. So across these four contexts and within this very compact 3 months, the main thing we wanted to achieve was the creation of an action agenda. And what we came up with was these 5 key buckets to really articulate these actions within. So to start with the priority bucket, we had 5 action items. And just to give one example from this bucket of a key action that we recommended, we recommend the development of scenario-based guidance and incentive models that frame inclusion policies along a humanitarian development and peace continuum. And so really trying to understand the incentives from a host government point of view around investing in the inclusion of adolescents and youth in the national system, but having different scenarios for different types of contexts like those that we looked at to be able to plan out this model. In the second bucket, which is sort of the dark grey or blue, where we're looking at data and evidence, understanding what works for who, when, and where. One of the key recommendations from the 2 action items that we make are to ask for interoperable data systems in which we're able to disaggregate forcibly displaced adolescents and youth and national populations, and with that disaggregation, monitor enrollment and retention risks, track academic outcomes, integrate health and protection indicators, and really be able to ensure timely and focused support for those at-risk populations to really uphold retention. In the third orange bucket on advocacy, we propose 5 action items. And one of the key action items to highlight is a briefing document with key messages that really articulate the long-term losses when primary education investments are not followed up with access to adequately resourced education, secondary education investments. And then in the fourth sort of teal bucket, looking at existing mechanisms and opportunities for financing. Given the current state of affairs that Nina was referring to earlier, of particular importance is the need to devise sort of responsibility sharing frameworks, and within that, sorry, turn my page, being able to find ways to strengthen private sector partnerships and really demonstrate the alignment of secondary education investments with market and talent pipeline interests. And some of you may have seen the news today that there's an exciting new initiative from UNHCR and MasterCard that provide significant funding to really secure education for employment pathways for refugee youth. And finally, in the red bucket, before I pass on to the panel, reflecting a lot of what we heard across the 4 contexts, we really need action on coordination and communication for adolescent and youth inclusion. And a key action item to highlight here is to really develop step-by-step guidance for policy dissemination from national to local levels and really ensure inclusive decision-making around these policies. And we want to do that by incorporating the voices of school leaders and teachers in particular, who have been impacted by a lot of these policies in ways that are difficult for their work and challenging for them to implement. But just as importantly, by including refugee youth and community leaders in policy discussions too. But all those action items are at the end of the publication, and we look forward to revisiting them in conversation and in the coming months as we look to bring this work to life. But back over to you, Nina, for the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Chris and Whitney. That was a lot of information and data to share in a very short period of time. I hope folks will have a chance to engage with the study itself and the report. So now I would like to invite the panelists for today. We have Ms. Shilin. She is the General Director of Education and Planning with the Ministry of Education and KRI. Welcome, Ms. Shilin. It's so great to have you here today. I was lucky enough to see you in action and meet you. And we have Catalina Gomez from Plan Colombia. And then another one of our panelists you've already met, we have Dr. Chris Henderson. So thank you everybody for joining. And we've prepared some questions around 3 key themes: teachers, social cohesion, and pathways beyond secondary. So starting with my first discussion question, in contexts such as KRI in Colombia, how have teachers been supported to act as drivers of inclusion for displaced learners in secondary education? And let's start with Ms. Shilin, and then we'll go to Catalina.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, my dear. I'm happy to be with you, all of you, and to participate in this panel concerning the Ministry of Education and our role in our school, especially dealing with you asked me with the replacement students, or what we call them IDP, correct? Hello.
Yes.
Do you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, because I have, I think that I missed a few things because the internet is not quite good with me. So concerning the replacement students, as Ministry of Education, we are not responsible for their education. The federal government of Iraq are responsible for their education. But instead of that, instead they didn't allocate a budget for them. The Ministry of Education has already done their best for the replacement students. First of all, those who have already been in the region and their native language is Kurdish, they have already been enrolled in our school. Even those who are native speaker of Arabic, we have enrolled them in our school, which the media of study is Arabic language. And also for the federal government, we have already given them 150 building or our school building to be used by the NDPs. And also we facilitate their examination and supervise them, as well as we provide them for those places which they rented for their education. We provide them with furniture to be used and able. Also, we allow the NGOs who works in the region to build a special school for the IDP. Some of them for example, there were for emergency being used. They have used caravan, for example, for their schools. So all these people, all these things have been done with the Ministry of Education. Also, we have included them in many researches and many assessments. We have done it. And also always we are in contact with them to find their needs and their need and what we can do to help them to have a better education with a qualified education. Also, we have already tried our best as a government to prevent the federal government to close the camps, which been used for the replaced students. So all these problem we have it, but we try to make them less being affected by any political or policy being implemented by whether the government or in Kurdistan or the government of Iraq. And we are continuously following up their cases because they are have been effective. They are suffering from insecure environment, and they have their problem. When they return back or they want to go back to their home city, they are facing problem of not having enough opportunity for education or the quality of education. All these problem we try our best to protect them according to the laws and regulation which allow us to deal with them. Otherwise, the federal government usually say that we are responsible, but in the reality, less has been done for them, and we are taking the responsibility with the NGOs and with especially the UN agency. We are holding the greatest part of support for them, and also we try our best to make our system more inclusive for all those type of teachers, or sorry, for all those type of students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Shilin. It's such an interesting example. And I just want to correct our panelist from Colombia is Pamela Escobar. So Pamela, over to you.
Thank you, Nina. First, it's important to recognize some elements of our context. For example, the way that the education system in Colombia works. Our system is decentralized. This implies that the Ministry of Education delegates functions and powers to the territorial entities at department, district, and municipality levels. This, of course, gives them autonomy to plan, manage, and coordinate the provision of the public education services. And in this sense, there are areas where the institutional framework is stronger and has more tools for teachers than other areas. This is a reality. We have like a rural and pretty apart zones in the territory. So this is a challenging context for the teachers. The second thing that to bear in mind is that when we talk in Colombia about to work on inclusion for displaced learners, we are talking about children and adolescents affected by armed conflict, but also for migration, or even in some cases for both. And there are, in most of the cases, huge differences between the urban areas and rural areas, also, as I mentioned before. This makes being a driver of inclusion for displaced learners a challenging job and implies having context-sensitive education. In this context, the Ministry of Education here in Colombia has implemented training programs for teachers working in areas affected by the armed conflict, affected by the migration, in order to strengthen their capacities to serve displaced students. Also, they have given guidelines focused on attention to diversity for displaced and conflict-affected learners, including pedagogical tools, psychosocial support, and a strategy for social cultural approaches to help integrate the students affected by crisis into the classroom. Also, of course, organizations as Plan International in Colombia and other NGOs in Colombia, we have also contributed to enable teachers to be agents of change in the inclusion of adolescents on the secondary education. For example, through capacity building processes in gender sensitive education. At the beginning, Nina talked about the difference and the gaps between girls and boys in terms of education, and with the implementation of programs to promote their enrollment and retention in the school system. These efforts have helped educators understand the complex backgrounds of displaced students and adapt their teaching methodologies, practices to create inclusive learning and environments and adapted to the needs of these learners.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Our next question is around social cohesion, and it's also linked to a question that was posed in the chat by Suzanne. So Suzanne, I hope you see a little bit of your answer to your question here. Where social tensions or xenophobia exist, what role can secondary schools and the broader education system play in promoting social cohesion and a sense of belonging? And I just want to read Suzanne's question, which was there any significant pushback from nationals about the integration of refugees into their schools? And how does the government address that? So those are very much linked. Why don't we start with Pamela on this one, and then we'll go to Ms. Shilin. And then Chris, if you have anything to add.
Perfect. The school is considering one of the most important protective environments for children and adolescents, especially in contexts affected by armed conflict or migration. That is the case of Colombia. Under this context, schools can serve as safe and inclusive spaces where students from different backgrounds, whether displaced by conflict or migration, are stimulated to share their experiences, cultures, identities, promoting social cohesion and sense of belonging for displaced youth. So this can be achieved through diverse initiatives like inclusive learning environments where teachers and the school create inclusive classrooms where they feel safe, support, value. This can involve the adaptation, even the adaptation of the teaching methods and offering psychosocial support. Other initiative could be the building cross-cultural understanding, promoting intercultural dialogue and understanding that curriculum, activities, community engagement can help bridge cultural gaps and foster a sense of belonging. Community engagement is other strategies, really, really important to work not only with the students, not only with the teachers. We need to work with all the community, engage the community, and involve the youth in the community activities, in local initiatives to help them to feel connected and contribute to their communities. Also, the peer support programs, providing opportunities for displaced youth to connect with their peers. This can help them to build social networks and develop a sense of belonging, also foster positive relationships and create a supportive environment. Social and emotional learning, and especially in our context, is really, really important. Integrating this into the curriculum. This can equip youth with the skills that they need to manage their emotions, build relationships, navigate in the new surroundings. This is so important and it's really key, especially in environment of crisis. And communications and collaboration. Of course, effective communications and collaborations between educators, between families, between community organizations are essential for supporting displaced youth, building strong partnerships and working together to address the needs of displaced youth.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Shilin.
Thank you, my dear. Before I go ahead in my answer, I just want to comment on one point and give clarification about it. In the Ministry of Education with the NGOs, especially UN agencies, we have implemented the policy of integration for the refugee. I think it was a unique policy, and it was the ultimate of humanity from our government that to equalize the students with our own citizen having the same responsibility, having the same duty, and were no differentiation between them and our own children, as well as neither between the gender of boy or girls. So all of them in front of the system of education having the same rights and everything. We implement the policy in all our schools. We have more than 5,000 schools. So already 2,000 schools, we have more than 50,000 refugee students have been implemented in our school, whether in basic and a good number in secondary school. But we cannot provide education for them in Arabic in such number of schools. We have a good number of schools study in Arabic, but because of lack of capacity for the teachers that they cannot speak Arabic, for example, we stick to a limited number of refugees. Therefore, the refugee who wants to continue in their study, either they have to join our school, Arabic school, and if they like, they can join the Kurdish, but we don't move anyone from a school. But our capacity for Arabic is limited. Just I find a comment, I wanted to correct it. Concerning the coherency of education and inclusive education, I think that we have a good example. We try our best in our school to give the students the life skill. And our government, and even in our curricula, we are encouraging students to accept the other and understand this is a human being having their same rights and everything. And what support my claim is as an assessment have been done by Save Children within the program of the MERP, which is funded by Education Cannot Wait, and UNHCR is part from it. One of the part of this study come with the conclusion that children or the citizen, our own children, they have more empathy and they are more social toward the refugee, while the refugee show less less degree of being social or empathy toward our own citizen. Therefore, this was an interesting finding in that assessment. We will try our best to work on it, but already we have worked on this subject. For example, we have youth club in our school. Within this youth club, they are sharing activity which may the refugee be interested in. They make them more social, more integrated in the society. Also, the peer work with each other, discussing with each other, having activity, all this to make them more social, more open to the society. And recently we are working on a subject, we call it the Green School. The Green School, we try our best to involve especially the refugees to how to make the school more green by planting trees, and in the same time to allocate a library, a small library under each tree, so that they feel that this is their corner, in order to feel they are their citizen, they are belonging to this place. And in the same time, for example, when we apply any project, we don't give any kind of regulation to differentiate between the refugee and our own resident or citizenship. Therefore, I think even in the national assessment like PISA and TIMSS, we have already integrated them, and we give them questionnaire which help the refugee to answer freely about how do they feel about the environment of school. Do they feel they are safe? Do they feel they are part of this system or not? This is also a finding will help us to find a solution for their problem. But I think that our own society is very friendly with them, And the proof for my speech is that even according to all the NGOs data and statistic, we have a good number of family have been moving from the camps to different cities after the implementation of the integration policy. There were some cities in Kurdistan, there were no refugees there, no child or no children's there who needs to be implemented school. After we implemented the refugee, policy or the integration policy, we find that even in a small, very small villages, in a hard geography place, we find there is a refugee students and they are integrated in the society and being enrolled in. To have 74% of refugee children already enrolled in our system is a good improve that we have worked on this point, but it doesn't mean that we will stop. But also we need the help of the NGOs, the stakeholders, and the sustainability of our program to go on in this side, because this program is very important. We don't forget that. According to our reports and the NGOs report, that those children mostly have suffered from trauma and violence. Therefore, we should have a special program for them in order to make them more engaged in activity and more feel secure to open and be more open to the society, in order to feel they are part of this society and they belong to this place and they belong to school, and the desk is belong to this desk, and everything in his school is in host service, and he has to live in a normal way without any kind of fear of or putting barrier between him and the other student. And recently also we have another activity which we call it the school parliament, or a teacher's school parliament. Yes, that the students start to debate the cases that's important for them. One of the issues was about the refugee and how refugees are acting or integrating in the society. So this is also a step forward in this aspect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's so much to talk about here. We have one last question, and then we're going to answer a little bit of the Q&A. So for our panelists, if you don't mind, just 2 minutes on this last question. How can we ensure that displaced adolescents completing secondary education are not left in limbo? Pamela, let's start with you, if you don't mind, just 2 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. It's essential to address the socioeconomic barriers that the adolescents in Colombia face, and work at educational level in development more opportunities for transition and continuity. In the case of Colombia, the family's socioeconomic status plays a decisive role in the adolescents' enrollment and retention. In many cases, young people are under high pressure to generate income to support the household economy, especially when education does not seem to offer immediate opportunities in the present and in the future to gain resources. This is why it's critical to design strategies that reduce the incentive to drop out, while increasing the relevance and accessibility of vocational training, vocational education, financial education, and of course, processes in terms of employment. One effective approach is to reduce the dropout rates by eliminating materials and systematic barriers. Like, for example, in the case of the students, the learning materials, the uniforms, the meals, the transportation support. This is why, for example, the projects implemented by the NGOs should include in their processes cash for education to remove some of the financial pressure that forces families to prioritize work over education. Also, the families plays an important role in the process, understanding the long-term benefits of education and promoting attendance. This is why it's key to involve them in the process as allies to reduce dropout rates. But this is a work that started even before on a systematic level. Partnerships between international organizations, the Ministry of Education are crucial to ensure displaced adolescents are not excluded from the secondary education. For example, in Colombia, the international NGOs have worked closely with the national education authorities to advocate for the inclusion for migrant students, particularly in situations where local schools leaders have cited issues like overcrowding or lack of resources as reasons for denying access. In some, ensuring that displaced adolescents are not left in limbo requires a holistic and collaborative approach, one that empowers families, removes economic and logistical barriers, adapt to students' reality, and strengthens the education system capacity to be inclusive, but also relevant, recognizing the needs of the displaced people and even adapting curricula and operating schemes, schedule, academic intensity, among others. When all these elements come together, we can provide real sustainable education opportunities for displaced youth and support their transition toward brighter futures.
For KRG, if I go on because we have less time, according to our own system, there is no barrier for education or secondary school education. They already we have 4,000 students being enrolled in our secondary school, whether it is, we have different branch, scientific branch, literary branch, or TVET, vocational, or even institutes. They are able to join. The only barrier is that if they have passed the examination or the examination for the 9th grade, which is according to the law or Iraqi law or the for Ministry of Education, each student should have this license or pass the 9th grade examination successfully or equivalent to. The only barrier for the refugee to join the secondary school, especially in Kurdistan region, is if they cannot approve that they have finished successfully the basic school. This is the only barrier, and we try our best with UNHCR before and many other to solve this problem, but unfortunately is out of the Ministry of Education in KRI's authority. It's on the federal government authority, and you know that the federal government is not supporting neither the integration policy for the refugee, neither they are they have a well-known definition for what's refugee or what the people or what kind of people they considered as a refugee. So therefore, this is a problematic political and also, let's say, regulation or law problem for us with the federal government to solve it. And in that case, we can integrate a good number of the students in our system. And in spite of these obstacles, we have already for many years have a kind of campaign, especially with the Save Children, although all the other NGOs supported and participate on it, the campaign for back to learning. We didn't exclude the refugee. The refugee was a great part of this. And what interesting finding that most of those students who have not been enrolled in the main system up to now, we thought that is related to their approving that have finished or any kind of paper to approve their claim. It seems that the financial aspect for the families is the main reason that when the children finish the basic school, they start to work to support their family. And when they start to work, they refuse to return back, because we have cases and we have a platform, it's recommended there, that we try our best to return back those students, and we provide them with opportunities and also some exception out of the regulation and everything. But after 1 or 2 months, they return for the second time, they drop up from school because they used to have work, they used to the life of adolescent and so on. This is one of the finding from our campaign. Otherwise, we are working with the NGOs to try our best to work on this subject and try to do our best as we succeeded in implementing the policy for integrating the refugees in the basic school, and mostly their problem have been solved. We try also our best to solve their problem with the secondary. One point I want to refer to, non-formal education is a very important factor here. And still we need to work on the non-formal education because providing non-formal education will give them an opportunity to catch up the main stream. Although in the Ministry of Education, we have already the option that we call them the external study. Any students or a person didn't catch up the basic school learning or didn't finish it, or any stage of this, he can, for example, have just the final examination after he, if he succeeded, according to his age, he can join other stages of study. Vocational study is also another opportunity for those students, but here's come a very important and crucial point. Is our study match the need of the market? This is a question. Also, we have to work to change a type of our TVET or vocational learning to match the need of, in order to make sure that those refugees have been skillful enough to find a job or to open a job in the coming days and integrate it in the society. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Sheelan. And we are wrapping up now. There's so much to talk about. I wanted to just invite Emilia Sorrentino from Plan. Plan has done such incredible work on this issue and this topic, and they were very much behind the study. So Emilia, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Nina, and thanks, Chris, thanks, Pamela from Plan International, Ms. Sheelan, and Whitney. I think this research confirms what we in Plan International have seen. So the national policy can open essential pathways for displaced adolescents and youth to access secondary education. But it also gives us the warning that without political leadership, sustained funding, and practical frontline support, this opportunity can easily stall or reverse. As you rightly said, Nina, as the humanitarian sector evolves, it's really our responsibility to ensure that secondary education remains visible and protected and a protected priorities and not, as you said, an afterthought. The research is also validates key areas of Plan's technical focus. Secondary education, as you rightly said, is protect adolescents from early marriage and recruitment by armed groups and armed forces, and also is a foundation for resilience and recovery. And it's an investment in social and economic recovery. This research has provided a strong platform, but it's also important to see, to look at what are the recommendations and what we must, the actions that we should take in the future. So turn national policy openings into fully funded and implemented commitments. Recognize and support teachers. They are key agents for learning, for protection, and for social cohesion. And Pamela has provided us some example, as well as Ms. Sheelan from Iraq. And then secure, flexible, and multi-year financing that can enable access, retention, but also transition, which is a very, very important point to ensure real opportunities for adolescents and youth. And as we said, keep secondary education visible and prioritized across humanitarian and development financing. So Plan International remains committed to work to secondary education with the secondary education working group partners to take this agenda forward. We remain committed to offer real and sustained education opportunities for adolescents and youth.